Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here with you all today. I hope you can hear me nice and clearly. I think I can hear myself, so I'm guessing that is the case. So I've been asked to talk for the next sort of 10 minutes or so around this idea about how physical and digital systems are kind of blurring together in our societies and in the way that we live, and possibly what the implications are for that blurring with respect to security, resilience, defense, and all of those sort of associated issues. So if you'll forgive me, what I'm going to do is just probably start with a little bit of a historical context with respect to especially what it means, what digital systems are, and really what the internet, for example, and this whole digital network mesh that we've created was intended to be in the first place. So if we go back to sort of, let's say, the 1990s, I was a postdoc, a PhD and a postdoc student at that time. We go around to around about that sort of time when the internet and the World Wide Web was really kind of becoming was a nascent technology, something that was growing very rapidly and was very, very new. We can recall, or we should recall, that some of the original ideas about this digital infrastructure that was being built was to do a number of things, to change the world in a number of ways. One was to create a kind of decentralized structure, a decentralized approach to the dissemination and the exchange of information and content, such that no one entity was really in control of all of this, and you could view this as being an opportunity or a movement towards trying to democratize access to information and information systems and data. We then also very, very quickly saw that this kind of revolution, as it was happening, was also a potential place or a mechanism by which innovation and invention, education, and various other things could actually start being delivered. And those of you who remember that time, as we also started seeing how retail might possibly be fundamentally changed as Amazon emerged as a company, and also search engines such as Google, etc., started taking hold. And very, very quickly after this original kind of occurrence or manifestation of the internet, it became clear that if we could use graphical environments coupled with this new digital infrastructure, we could probably create virtual worlds within which we can actually walk, interact with each other, and potentially even kind of live. And so if we look at the idea of Second Life at the time, we'll see that in fact that's exactly what was envisaged with something like Second Life. So some of you would remember walking around virtual islands and virtual cities and virtual towns and even conferences and classrooms inside Second Life as this kind of virtual environment where people had their own physical avatars, or sort of avatars, digital representations of a physical person walking around inside this digital space. And very, very quickly after that, we also saw that the internet could be a place where social media and just general communications could happen in a very, very different way. And so, of course, we see this massive rise and growth over the years of social media as a platform for which we can interact with each other over very, very large distances in very informal, agile, and quick ways. So this was the whole idea of the internet to start off with, this decentralized, democratized, kind of new way of working, if you like. What eventually ended up happening, though, however, if we look at the current states of things, is that we ended up with a very highly centralized digital system, actually, where a few large corporations and a few very large global entities control and effectively kind of manage this entire internet system. And we see some barriers to entry rather than actually barriers, the ability for anybody to be able to sort of partake of this internet. And one of those barriers to entry is potentially the provision of personal information. So there was this kind of deal that was being done whereby if you exchange some of your personal information and data, then you were able to use the kind of services and systems on the internet. And that has kind of grown and grown over the years. And one of the real kind of rationales that was kind of put forward for this being a great model, of course, is that centralization of the internet meant that that sort of control that brought you also brought with it security and brought with it resilience and brought with it all of the things that you might want when you start thinking about the vulnerabilities that might exist on the internet space. And what we ended up with today is a digital system, or an internet, if you like, that has much greater similarity to conventional systems and institutions than it does to that original idea of decentralization and disruption. And that's kind of what we've ended up today. So let's go back into thinking about how, when we were looking at Second Life, one of the things we really wanted to do in those virtual spaces was to blur this boundary between digital systems and the physical world. We started seeing an emergence of an idea about where we could actually have money, such as the Logan dollars inside Second Life. We could transact pieces of land, and we could actually sort of start emulating the physical world. There were even classrooms for doing things like building nuclear power stations, and there were conferences, as I mentioned earlier on, held inside Second Life. So this, you can see, is an attempt to try and create this kind of virtual world which has some kind of connection to the physical world. However, there were several barriers as to why this didn't just take off at the time, okay? And one of the things, some of the key aspects that were needed to try and create a better linkage between what I will call our physical reality and our digital reality didn't really exist. And these are some of the things that probably didn't exist at the time, that meant that we are revisiting this idea of this virtual space because some of these challenges have actually been addressed. One key thing that didn't exist was really this very, very intimate and central connection between our digital world and our physical objects and our physical systems. And what's happened since then is we've started seeing the embedding of small-scale, low-power computing systems into nearly everything in our lives. If we look at smart cities, if we look at the idea of the Internet of Things, this is effectively the idea that starts driving us towards the digitization and the placing of all physical objects onto the Internet. A second issue that we had was that some of these virtual spaces were not really that great in terms of them replicating reality. They were kind of a bit clunky, low resolution. There was not great interactivity with them. There wasn't a way of fully immersing yourself inside those spaces. And again, if we look at what's happened today through games development and also a huge kind of development around the idea of digital twins and the kind of sophistication of the graphics that are capable, we start seeing an immersive environment that is possible, which is far, far more engaging than it was way back in the sort of 90s and the early 2000s. And another critical system, perhaps one of the most critical things to prevent us from actually having a proper living environment inside these sort of digital spaces, was the absence of a proper economic system. And the idea always was here, how can we create a sort of decentralized economic system that disintermediated the kind of large physical banking institutions that we currently have, or we currently have and we had then? How could we emulate, by doing that, how could we still retain the ideas of scarcity, creating valuable digital objects? And then how could we also emulate a way of exchanging value and selling, if you like, and transacting these rare things in this sort of disintermediated digital space? And of course, one of the huge sort of things that has changed, that has enabled that, is the invention of Bitcoin, and also the ideas associated with that with respect to decentralized ledgers, distributed systems, and the blockchain. So all of these barriers have effectively, in one way or another, been rapidly eroded over the last few decades, getting us to a point where the development of a true virtual living environment, or what we would term to be a metaverse, that meshes very clearly and links to our physical world is actually possible. So if you think about real world examples, you can imagine very quickly the idea of us somebody working, shall we say, on an oil platform without ever actually being on the oil platform, because the digital twin environment is so rich. But we can go even one step further and imagine that we are able to create whole digital companies, a whole digital energy company in digital space through something called decentralized autonomous organizations, and never meet actually any of the people who are actually putting this company together. And in that company, we can trade, transact, and have a whole financial system that is also linked to the physical world very closely. And this is the thing that has really kind of game changed this whole space in the last few years. And so we now have all of the systems in place to kind of give us a more immersive and connected digital space to our real physical space. But something else very important has happened too, and that is with the emergence of things like blockchain technologies, we've understood how to revisit that original aspiration of decentralization. And there was a big movement through what we would call Web 3.0 technologies to now refactor and return and recover, if you like, the original idea of a fully decentralized internet without any of the central systems and services and structures that we see currently. And so if we marry this idea of decentralization with the metaverse, we start seeing some very interesting possibilities for the world, but also some very interesting cyber and cyber physical risks that might emerge. So for the last minute or so, I would just explain what some of these issues might be. So if we see that human beings can actually create, work, play, but also commit crimes, help each other, but also go to war, all of this inside these kind of metaverse environments which actually have real world physical consequences, we can start seeing the kind of risks that that start emerging. In this sort of environment, we also see the emergence of a pseudonymous economy, a situation where individuals can manage multiple identities simultaneously, making other issues around security very difficult and challenging to manage. So, for example, attribution of crimes becomes potentially a problem. Identifying culpability inside some sort of security scenario can become another problem. And so we also see related issues, such as an inability for us to understand how security standards might be set in this environment, how policing might be executed, who would write regulations in this space, and also how would you manage recourse or compensations if something were to go wrong. I will finish just by saying this is just supposed to be a very brief outline, but this idea of decentralization, there is also a myth that decentralization equals insecurity, and this is just not true. The idea that decentralization is equated to insecurity is probably promoted by people who think that there is only one way to achieve security, and that's their way if they have a centralized control. The reality of the situation is that if we architect things properly, decentralization can actually give us far greater security benefits, and it's quite probable that in the future there will be a hybrid environment between centralization and decentralization. But inside this space, when we do have decentralized finance, for example, and decentralized economies, we do have to ask ourselves the questions such as, what will citizenship in a nation state look like in the future? And therefore, will people be more closely aligned to their web communities or their web tribes than they will be to nation states? And I think that has real ramifications and implications for how we think about global security, defense, cybersecurity, and cyber physical security as a whole. So I will stop there. Thank you.